It is 2009. The most powerful chip company in the world writes a check for $1.25 billion, not to build a factory, not to acquire a rival, but to make a lawsuit disappear. The charge: paying billions in secret rebates to PC makers to ensure they never, under any circumstances, bought a chip from AMD. Intel didn't lose a product war. They lost because they cheated and got caught. But the story of how AMD survived long enough to collect that check is the most improbable comeback in the history of the semiconductor industry. The dominant empire Intel was founded in 1968 by Gordon Moore and Robert Noyce, two men who had already changed the world once at Fairchild Semiconductor. Moore had published his famous law in 1965. The number of transistors on a chip would double roughly every 2 years. It wasn't just a prediction. At Intel, it became a corporate religion. By 1993, Intel launched the Pentium processor and cemented its grip on every desk, office, and living room that had a computer in it. The Intel Inside campaign, launched in 1991, is one of the most effective ingredient branding campaigns in history, spending over $250 million annually to make consumers demand a chip they would never see. By 2000, Intel controlled 83% of the global processor market. Their revenue that year was $33.7 billion. You are looking at a company so dominant, it didn't just compete in the microchip market. It was the microchip market. The idea that any rival could threaten them was not just unlikely. It seemed structurally impossible. Advanced Micro Devices was founded in 1969, 1 year after Intel, by Jerry Sanders, a former Fairchild salesman who wore custom suits and drove a Rolls-Royce. Sanders was everything Intel's engineers were not: loud, theatrical, obsessed with image. His competitors dismissed him as a showman. That was a mistake. Sanders understood something profound. In a commodity market, brand is survival. AMD spent its early decades as a licensed clone maker, legally producing Intel-compatible chips under a 1982 cross-licensing agreement that Intel later tried, unsuccessfully, to cancel. That agreement gave AMD technical access to Intel's architecture. It was the foothold. In 1996, AMD hired a quiet, methodical engineer from Digital Equipment Corporation named Dirk Meyer. Meyer had designed the Alpha processor, at the time one of the fastest chips ever built. He came to AMD with a single mission: design a chip that didn't just match Intel, one that beat it. In 2003, AMD shipped the Athlon 64, the first consumer processor with 64-bit architecture. Intel had nothing comparable for 18 months. For the first time in a decade, the underdog was ahead. Round 1, 2000, the Gigahertz race. On March 6, 2000, AMD crossed the 1 GHz barrier first. Their Athlon processor hit the milestone days before Intel's Pentium 3 could match it. It was not just a technical achievement, it was a public humiliation for a company that had defined processor performance for a decade. Intel scrambled, rushed their own 1 GHz chip to market within days, and then watched their Pentium 3 chip catch fire during a live demonstration at CeBIT in Hanover. The footage ran on technology news sites around the world. Intel's response was to accelerate the Pentium 4, a chip optimized entirely for raw clock speed. It hit 3.6 GHz by 2002. On paper, the numbers were staggering. In practice, the architecture was thermally inefficient and slower on real-world workloads than AMD's lower clock Athlon chips. Intel had won the megahertz war and lost the performance war simultaneously. AMD gained meaningful market share for the first time. By 2002, they held roughly 18% of the processor market. It was modest. It was enough to keep them in the fight. Round 2, 2003-2006, AMD pulls ahead. The Athlon 64, launched in September 2003, ran existing 32-bit software while simultaneously supporting 64-bit computing. It was a genuine architectural leap. Microsoft and major software developers certified AMD's implementation as the standard, meaning Intel was forced to adopt AMD's 64-bit instruction set, not the other way around. A company a fraction of Intel's size had set the technical standard for the industry. In 2006, AMD made its most aggressive move yet, a $5.4 billion acquisition of ATI Technologies, the graphics chip maker. The bet was on convergence, that the future of computing would require processors and graphics chips to work in tighter harmony than Intel's architecture allowed. It was the right thesis, executed at the wrong time at a price AMD could not afford. The debt from that acquisition would haunt them for a decade, but in 2006, AMD's market share peaked at 26%. For one brief window, the giant was genuinely threatened. Round 3, 2007-2012. Intel cheats and AMD bleeds. Intel's response to AMD's competitive threat was not purely technical. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating through the mid-2000s, Intel paid billions in secret rebates to Dell, HP, Lenovo, NEC, and other major PC manufacturers on the condition that they buy exclusively, or almost exclusively, from Intel. The payments were structured as marketing development funds and volume discounts. The effect was simple. AMD was locked out of the shelves of every major PC maker on Earth, regardless of how good their chips were. The European Commission fined Intel 1.06 billion euros in 2009, the largest antitrust fine in European history at that time. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission filed its own complaint. New York's Attorney General settled separately. In total, Intel paid over $2.5 billion in fines and settlements across multiple jurisdictions. The company that had built its empire on engineering had spent a decade defending it with payments. AMD survived barely. Between 2007 and 2015, they lost money in 7 of 8 years. Their market share collapsed to below 20%. In 2012, they sold their headquarters building in Sunnyvale and leased it back to raise cash. The company that had beaten Intel to 64-bit computing was weeks from irrelevance. In 2012, AMD hired Lisa Su, an MIT-trained semiconductor engineer who had spent years at IBM and Freescale. Su became CEO in 2014 when AMD stock was trading at $2.49 a share. She made one decision that defined everything that followed. She killed AMD's attempts to chase Intel on all fronts and focused the entire engineering organization on a single new architecture, codenamed Zen. On March 2nd, 2017, AMD launched the Ryzen 7 1800X. It matched Intel's flagship Core i7 690-100K processor in multi-threaded performance, and it cost $499. Intel's equivalent chip cost $1,189. The tech press ran benchmarks and read them twice. The performance gap that had defined the processor market for a decade had closed to statistical noise at half the price. Ryzen pre-orders crashed AMD's website. Retailers reported waiting lists within hours of launch. By 2019, AMD held 30% of the CPU market. By 2021, Their server chip, the ePyYC processor, had captured 10% of the data center market Intel had owned entirely. Lisa Su's AMD was not the AMD that had nearly gone bankrupt in 2015. It was something Intel had never faced, a rival with nothing to lose, and a chip that was genuinely, measurably better. The turning point was not Ryzen. It was the decision Lisa Su made in 2014 to stop being a smaller version of Intel and start being a fundamentally different kind of chip company. Intel's dominant position had made them structurally conservative. Every architecture decision was optimized to protect the margins of the product line they already owned. AMD had no margins to protect. That asymmetry was the advantage. Intel's critical failure was a decade of complacency at the manufacturing level. In 2014, Intel was manufacturing chips on a 14-nanometer process, industry-leading at the time. By 2021, they were still primarily on 14 nano. AMD had outsourced its manufacturing to TSMC, which by 2020 was producing AMD's chips on a 7-nanometer process. The performance per watt advantage that resulted was not incremental. It was generational. Intel's fabs, once their greatest competitive moat, had become their greatest liability. What Intel refused to accept was that manufacturing leadership and design leadership are separate disciplines, and that losing one does not merely slow you down, it compounds. Every generation AMD pulled ahead on process node. They extended the lead on the next generation too. Intel is still recovering from that decade of manufacturing stagnation today. AMD won the chip war by surviving the monopoly, and Intel lost it by believing that paying to stay dominant was the same thing as earning it. The first lesson: a monopoly maintained by payments rather than performance is a countdown timer, not a moat. Every dollar Intel spent on illegal rebates was a dollar not spent on the manufacturing investment that would have kept AMD behind on process nodes. Structural advantages decay the moment you stop building them and start buying them instead. The second lesson: near-death focus is a competitive weapon. Between 2012 and 2017, AMD's constraints forced them to bet everything on one architecture rather than spreading resources across 10 product lines. Ryzen is not a story of abundance. It is a story of what a team produces when failure is not abstract. If your company is comfortable, ask yourself what you have stopped being willing to risk. The third lesson: outsource what your competitor owns. Intel's fabs were their identity. AMD's decision to use TSMC's foundries, surrendering control of manufacturing, was widely criticized as a sign of weakness. It turned out to be the single decision that let a $2 stock become a $160 stock in 8 years. Sometimes the thing your competitor is most proud of is the thing you should refuse to compete on directly. AMD survived a monopoly, rewrote the chip industry, and turned a $2 stock into one of the most valuable semiconductor companies on earth. But the company that is now threatening both Intel and AMD, not by building faster chips, but by designing chips that make theirs irrelevant. That story is more disruptive than anything you've seen yet. That story is next. This is the Rivalry Code.